thank you for the invitations to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Bahrain. I want to talk to you about something that's a different take on process safety. I want to talk to you about process safety risks and how we look at those during mergers and acquisitions. So if I live in the States, when you buy a house, you go and hire an appraiser. And the appraiser comes and looks at the house and figures out if there's anything broken or something that needs to be fixed. And then an adjustment is made to the sale price. And then you basically take the credit when you buy the house. We're looking at something very similar for chemical plants or oil and gas assets, except it's a little bit more devious than, appraising your house. Let me give you some background so you can get your mindset on that as I start talking about the important process safety risks and the issues that you need to look at if you're buying or selling plants. Okay? There's a little graphic on my presentation here that shows that, at least in the US, and I'm pretty sure this is similar also worldwide, most of the plants are actually aging. We have plants that are 40 years old. We have plants that are 60 years old. They're running well beyond, what they were designed to do. A lot of these plants have been debottlenecked, for increases in flow. We're pushing the temperatures and the pressures higher. We're getting close to the design margins. Furthermore, as you heard this morning, a lot of the old people, like myself, and many of the others that were active in the process safety are retiring. And you also have you may have inadequate equipment, structure proofing, all sorts of things in these plants that you really need to look at so you can figure out what you're buying before you buy it or before you sell it. I spend a lot of my time doing expert testimony. So when there are disputes related to process safety management and process safety management practices, it just so happens that we have more lawyers in New York probably than we have lawyers in the entire Middle East. So typically these cases end up in front of the court system, and you have to figure out how to apportion the responsibilities. But look at this scenario. Company A sells several plants to Company B. Company B, during the process of buying the plants, agreed to do a limited due diligence because Company A had a fine reputation in the marketplace, and Company A represented to Company B that we're in compliance with all the regulations, and we have good safety programs, we have good programs all around, so you don't really need to do a very deep due diligence. Shortly after the company takes over the new assets, they figured out that there are substantial deficiencies in the process safety systems. That's not to also say that there wasn't deficiencies in the environmental systems, which tend to sort of dwarf the process safety systems. However, we're still looking at several $100 million worth of stuff. Company B then went to Company A and said, you warranted to me that these things were in compliance, but they're not. So you need to pay me back several $100 million for all the things you warranted that were good, but they're not. This case ended up in court. Both companies ended up spending about $70 million each on litigation costs. And at the end, Company B prevailed and was able to recover several $100 million in fees because of the warranties and the representations that the seller had made that weren't true. You all know who CCPS is. CCPS published a guideline on how to look at process safety risks during the merger and acquisitions process. The CCPS member companies, during the workshops, basically stated or collectively stated that typically you're looking at anywhere between 10 to 30% of the sale price in terms of what we're just talking about. So what they're ending up doing is paying 10% more or 30% more because of all these process safety issues that they're having to fix afterwards. So over the last 10 years, the total value of mergers and acquisitions worldwide is about $15 trillion. What's 10% of that? That's substantial, right? It's a lot of money. The typical things that you'd have to fix if you're not careful. These are real cases. One company indicated that it cost them about $40 million to retrofit a control room because the control room wasn't adequately blast-proofed. Another company found, and that's probably an extreme, found that retrofitting the facility cost them almost 100 times what it would have cost them if they had built it from new, and so on and so on. So how do we get into a point where we actually know all this stuff before we buy the plant? Or how do we do a reverse due diligence on the buyer before we sell them the plant? Process safety risks are not just compliance risks. You're looking at risks from management failures, you're looking at human failures, you're looking at mechanical failures, control systems failures. You may even be looking at external events. Okay? Like for example, if you want to buy a plant in California, you do know that in California it's earthquake country. In fact, we don't build large-scale LNG tanks in California because of the earthquake proofing that would be required for those tanks. It's cost prohibitive. So during the mergers and acquisition process, you have to really look at these issues. And for large deals, you may even want to go and conduct a quantitative risk assessment to figure out what the risk exposure is before you buy the asset. Okay? You got to remember also that process safety incidents almost always will lead to environmental impact. And dollars for environmental impact cleanup could be substantially larger than the process safety deficiencies. During the mergers and acquisition process, the information that's typically requested is, give me statistics about your injuries, okay? So occupational health and safety statistics are typically exchanged. But good injury rate does not mean that you have good process safety programs, okay? The two are not equivalent. However, poor injury statistics basically say that you don't have a chance that the other stuff is good either, right? So you gotta be careful. If you're only looking at occupational health data, that doesn't mean that the process safety systems are in good shape. I'm not going to talk to you about the mergers and acquisitions process. It's a well-established process. It's a systematic process. We run through it all the time. I just want to focus on the process safety-related issues. Before you buy a plant, you need to figure out whether the plant has process safety issues, and how do you do that? Your M&A team, your mergers and acquisitions team, typically does not have process safety professionals on it. Because typically you have lawyers, you have business people, you may have some environmental people, but the process safety people are almost always missing from the team. What we're looking at is really what the assets, what's the integrity look like for the assets? And what do we need to do? What is the cost of actually having to fix all these deficiencies if we buy the plant? Also, you got to remember, if you're buying a plant that's making CFCs and next year there's going to be a regulation that's going to outlaw the CFCs, you need to know about that, right? And you need to know about whether the plant is already, has already violations, or they have other things that are related to process safety that are not totally obvious, okay? So you need to look at the regulatory and the legal issues. But you have to look at the red flags first. Like, for example, if the facility is near a densely populated center, you got to realize that emissions and other things are going to be challenged all the time, right? And If you look at a company that you're buying and they're not a member of API, they're not a member of CCPS, they're not a member of ICME, that basically says these guys aren't really in tune with the process safety requirements. You might want to think about that. The big ticket items, when you're looking at acquiring plants or selling plants, are really related to process safety information and mechanical integrity. We're looking at lots of dollars associated with that. Vessel and piping inspections, for example. You have no idea what it would cost, or maybe you do have an idea, what it would cost to inspect a large storage tank. Okay? The cost associated with inspecting a large storage tank could run you millions of dollars. The case I was talking to you about earlier, the plants that were sold happened to have a lot of storage tanks, say about 200 of them, okay? And it turns out that those storage tanks were low-pressure storage tanks. Since the inception of the plant, they never had an internal inspection. So the bottoms of those tanks were not inspected because the company that operated them did not want to have to drain the tank, put scaffolding around the tank, inspect the bottoms. It's about $2–3 million to inspect one of those tanks. Multiply that by 100. How much is that? That's $200 million in just tank inspections if you want to be in compliance, right? Also, you have to be in compliance with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice. And that's very, very broad. It depends on where the plant that you're buying is located. If it's located in the United States, and there are a lot of companies that are located in the Middle East that are buying assets in the US. For example, SABIC has bought assets, Aramco has bought assets. You need to be aware of the fact that the RAGA-GAP requirements could be really significant because if the facility is covered by OSHA PSM, you have to meet RAGA-GAP. And RAGA-GAP evolves over time. I don't expect you to read this, but if you're looking at RAGA-GAP, you're looking at a whole bunch of engineering standards and international standards that you have to comply with, and that's a lot. You have to look at management of change, the design standards, the incident investigations, mechanical integrity, process safety information, all that stuff have to be looked at. How many of you have participated in actually an M&A exercise? It could be a daunting task. Also, you can't forget about the safety culture, right? And you have to look at what records are available in association with training and other things. All the M&As typically start with a checklist, okay? And these checklists that are used for M&As are considered by many companies to be intellectual property. For example, if you were, I don't know, let's pick XYZ Chemical, and you're in the business of selling or buying assets, that M&A checklist is going to be very precious because you have built into that checklist all the things that we're talking about here, right? So you don't really want to give it out to anybody. However, CCPS published a book on process safety considerations during the mergers and acquisition, and there is a checklist in that book, in that guideline, that was provided by 5 or 6 major companies. It was scrubbed, put together, and sanitized. And if you're expecting that you're going to be buying assets or selling assets, I would strongly recommend you should get that. Okay, and in the checklist, there are all the categories of interest are covered by the checklist, and you know what? Most of all, it's free. You can get it from the CCPS website. You shouldn't have to read that, but this is what this checklist looks like, right? They also have, in that guideline, an implementation plan, which is where a lot of people sort of trip. You've made the acquisition, and now you have to integrate the two companies or the assets, and they trip on the implementation. So there's also guidance on how to do that. Both the seller and the buyer have to really look at what the process safety issues are. So if you're selling it, you want to know what you're selling, and where the soft spots are. If you're buying it, you also want to do the same. I would say this, that as companies become more international and they're buying international assets, this gets to be more and more difficult, right? And it's very, very challenging. But I think moving forward, because of all these issues and because they could be very costly, process safety will be integrated in the mergers and acquisitions process. I'm just going to skip this because I'm running out of time. I will say one thing. In the US, when you buy an asset, right, just because you're a new owner does not absolve you from the liability of what happened with the previous owner. Even though you may argue to the OSHA people that it's a different employer, that doesn't count. And there has been several law cases where, for example, Delek Refining got cited for facilities they bought, even though the violations were committed by the previous owner, right? So if you're involved in mergers and acquisitions, I would strongly recommend you go take a look at the CCPS guideline. We actually were the contractor that wrote that guideline on mergers and acquisitions for CCPS. The spreadsheets are very valuable, and the information in there is also very valuable. Thank you for your attention.